Our next network service we'll take a look at is DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. This allows a client to come onto the network, send out a query, and receive an IP address automatically. Without DHCP, we would have to go to each system and statically configure an IP address. This automates that process and makes life much easier. You can see on the screen a shot from Windows, where we've got the DHCP utility. One of the most important things we have to think about doing is setting up a scope. A scope is a range of IP addresses the DHCP server can issue. So, I might have a scope between 10.11.100 and 10.11.200, for instance, and then DHCP would be able to issue IP addresses anywhere in that range. When I say DHCP will issue those addresses, it doesn't give a client IP addresses forever. Ain't nothing free. What DHCP does is it leases an IP address to the client, and the typical lease is 8 days. So, it will lease an address to a client for 8 days, and if that client wants to renew their lease, they can contact DHCP after 4 days and ask, "Hey, can I continue my lease?" And if DHCP is accessible, it says, "Sure." If not, the client will try again and again, and if it can't contact the DHCP server, the entire process just starts over. We'll talk about what that leasing process is in just a second. You can also reserve IP addresses for specific servers. When you reserve an IP address, let's say I have a file server and I'd like that file server to always have the same IP address, I can create a reservation for that file server, enter its MAC address, and that way, when that file server comes online to get an IP address from DHCP based on its MAC, it will be given that specific reserved IP address. I can also exclude IP addresses from the range. So maybe I'm going to give out IP addresses from 10.11.100 to 10.11.200, but 10.11.50 is a print server that I want to assign manually. I can just exclude from that range, and 10.11.50 won't be given to any other device, and I'll have to manually configure the print server. So, with reservations, a specific IP address is given to a specific host. With exclusions, the IP address is removed from the range, and that requires the administrator to manually assign that address. Sometimes exclusions are better. If you have really critical servers, it's best to just statically assign an IP address. Some services require that you do. But also, if you have a really critical server and you think about what would happen if DHCP is down and I couldn't access that critical server, that could really be a problem. When you have those really important servers on the network, it's probably just better to go ahead and give them a static address and exclude the address from that range. I mentioned the leasing process just a few minutes ago, so let's go ahead and look at this. You can remember the DHCP lease process through DORA: Discover, Offer, Request, Acknowledge. The way the Discover process works is when a client comes online, it sends out a broadcast message that basically says, "Hey, is anybody out there? DHCP server?" Every DHCP server that hears the query responds and says, "I'm a DHCP server, and here's an IP address for you." Now, the client is going to request the first IP address that it received as an offer. Then, that DHCP server is going to come back and acknowledge the client has been offered an IP address, and it's going to remove the IP address from its scope. So that's the DORA process. Now, there are a couple little things to note here. First of all, to start the Discover message is a broadcast. There are some devices that don't allow broadcasts to pass, specifically routers. We'll talk in a later chapter about what routers are and some of the peculiarities of them, but one of the things a router does is lock broadcasts. There are some broadcasts that you don't want to go through your entire network. You might want some broadcasts limited to certain segments, so a router does that for us. But if I'm trying to get an IP address on the other side of a router, then my broadcast is going to be blocked. There are a couple things we can do about this. There's something called a DHCP relay agent, which is a kind of service you install on the router that will forward those DHCP requests. There are also certain routers referred to as RFC 1542 compliant routers. You can also hear them referred to as BOOTP routers. These will also forward those Discover messages from clients. All right, so the next service we look at is called IPAM, IP Address Management. So we may be in an environment that has multiple locations throughout the world. We may have thousands and thousands of hosts. When you start to work with a very large organization, it becomes very challenging to keep up with all your network segments, the IP addresses, and any sort of naming resolution issues. So, there are a series of software tools that will assist you with determining what IP addresses are in use, whether or not they're being fully utilized, and any sort of issues that you might have with your DHCP server or scope. You could also even use it with incident response because it's able to detect the IP addresses that are being used. So that's going to bring us to the end of the services. We looked at DNS, DNS for name resolution, and determining where services are. We looked at DHCP for automatic IP address assignment, and then we looked at IPAM as a means of managing a more complex environment and keeping track of IP address scopes and names as well.